At the outset, I'd like to thank the museum and in particular Ranjit for having invited me for this panel discussion. The most obvious instance of Goan engagement musically with any external source is that of Goan musicians studying Western music. Several kinds of Western music, whether it's art music, classical music, or jazz, and many of them have gone on to becoming some of the best known practitioners of Western art music and jazz, and later also became sessions musicians in Hindi cinema ensembles. But there's yet another very important instance of Goan engagement with music of an external source, and this is with Hindustani music or the North Indian classical tradition. And I'd like to put that in a historical context, how that happened. So, post 1857, which is when you had the revolt against the British, post 1857, British colonial government had crippled princely power, Indian princely power, and as you all are aware that most of the patronage for classical music until then came from the royal patrons. As a result of the crippling of this power, there was a sharp decline in patronage to Hindustani music and musicians, as a result of which many musicians from northern and central India moved to colonial cities where they felt they could locate patronage from the commercial, industrial and intellectual elite situated in these cities. So primarily the migration took place to Calcutta and Bombay. So here what's relevant is the migration to Bombay. Apart from the musicians who came from northern and central India, there was a large migration of musicians from Goa and neighboring areas. And many of these musicians came from the Devdasi community. Contemporary commentators have suggested different reasons for this migration. One reason could be to escape the exploitation of wealthy patrons here. The other is, of course, to search for new sources of livelihood, more lucrative than what was available here as temple attendants. And a third, of course, could be a creative urge for learning musical forms that they were unfamiliar with, but which could provide them with better sources of patronage in the colonial city. So it is in this historical context that I'd like to place the contribution of Kesarbai Kerkar, one of the most iconic figures in 20th century Hindustani music history. Until the age of 16, Kesarbai was primarily living in Goa, and she tried to study music from musicians who migrated, or rather passed through Goa to southern regions. So, at the age of 8, she stayed in Kolhapur and learned for a period of 8 months from vocalist and Kirana stalwart Abdul Karim Khan. On her return to Goa, she trained with Ramakrishna Bua Vaze during his visits here. But when she moved to Bombay at the age of 16 with her mother and uncle, she studied first with sitar player Barkatullah Khan. After that, Barkatullah Khan was employed as a court musician in Patiala. So, as a result of which she had to change her teacher, and she requested Alladia Khan, founder of the Jaipur Atroli Gharana, to teach her. I'm recounting this also because this is a perfect example of what musicians who were seeking good gurus had to go through during this period. It was not easy to locate a guru, then convince the guru to teach, because this was the Guru Shishya Parampara, or master disciple tradition. So they had to go through a very arduous regimen before they could actually convince the guru to teach them. So she learned briefly with Aladia Khan, but she couldn't really grasp his vocal style in that short span of time. And then, of course, Aladia Khan moved to Kolhapur due to ill health. So once again, Kesarbai had to learn from somebody else. So she approached Barkatullah Khan, who would spend his vacation from the Patiala Darbar in Pune and Bombay. But then again, Barkatullah Khan got employment in the Mysore Darbar. So once again, Kesarbai had to shift gurus. So she learned from Bhaskar Bua Bakle. Again, Bhaskar Bua Bakle moves to Pune. So she learns once again from Ramakrishna Bua Baze. Finally, in 1980, that's a turning point in her career as a student. She gives a rather unimpressive recital at a soiree which was held to felicitate Lala Dulichand, a patron from Calcutta. So Lala Dulichand would often come to Bombay, and it was almost he was almost like a royal patron. So he had a retinue of musicians who would perform for him through the night. And so Kesarbai performed here, but it was not a very successful performance. And she decided then that she must try to learn in a sustained manner from Aladia Khan, whose style really impressed her. So at first, Aladia Khan was not very happy to accept her as a disciple, but she impressed upon him through a wealthy businessman. And finally, the Ganda Bandhan took place on January 1st, 1921. Ganda Bandhan is the ceremony where the master accepts the student as a disciple by tying a sacred thread on the wrist. But there was a contractual arrangement, which was a written agreement, very not really done during those times, but it's interesting to know what was put down. First, a predetermined amount was to be given to Aladia Khan at the Ganda Bandhan ceremony. Second, a monthly salary was to be paid to him. Third, the training would continue for approximately 10 years. So until then she couldn't perform. Fourth, salary was not to be withheld in case of his absence from tuition due to ill health or if he were not in town. 5, she would have to travel to any town or city he chose to move to and continue training with him there. It's interesting that this is a period where you find that the kind of overt commercialization of Hindustani music training takes place, and that's because of circumstances in the city. Aladia Khan was also trying to live a comfortable life in Bombay, and the only way he could do it was through tuition. At the same time, there was that much of the Guru Shishya Parampara as well, the traditional part as well. So after a month's training in Bombay, Kesarbai had to travel to Sangli, where Aladia Khan was recuperating after a bout of illness. The training continued on their return to Bombay, and now I'd like to recount what the training sessions were like. So the morning session typically started at 8 a.m. daily, okay? 8 a.m. and continued until 1 p.m. The second session for the day would begin at 4 p.m. and continue until 8 p.m. In addition, Kesarbai had to do intensive practice in the lower octave from 5:30 a.m. to 7:30 a.m. So that's pretty much all the waiting hours. Practicing for long hours took its toll on her voice, but it was only in extreme cases that Alladia Khan allowed Kesarbai to rest for 2 or 3 days, as he believed in an unbroken practice regimen. So this routine continued for 8 years. Later, Alladia Khan took up more tuitions in Bombay and taught Kesarbai only in the mornings. And finally, he moved with a drama company, theatre company, Shankarrao Sarnaik's drama company, for 14 months. So it's after this intensive training period of around 10 years that Kesarbai Kerkar's career as a performer truly begins. The Kesarbai that we know today from her recordings. The first set of her recordings was done by a label run by two Gujarati businessmen. The label was called Broadcast label. And this was in 1935, and the recordings were done at sessions held at the Blavatsky Lodge in Bombay. So it's interesting to see how Kesarbai molded her performance career, how she approached recitals. And this I have got to know not only from documentary evidence in scattered references, but also while interviewing people who are very close to her, listeners, music lovers, and even musicians. So she was very uncompromising with her music. So the strict discipline that she followed was apparent in her career as a performer. She never agreed to a program offer if experiencing indifferent health. Accepting an engagement was followed by planning the repertoire for the concert and regular practice with her accompanist. Practice of that repertoire. This was largely unheard of when we look at other performers, but she obviously wanted everything to be perfect. And finally, she decided to retire when she felt that her voice was failing her, which was again unheard of, and it's still unheard of today. People continue performing, even if they are out of tune. So she was one of the highest paid artists in her time. Apparently, she charged 1,500 rupees per performance, and it was a little more if it was outside Bombay. The others were getting around, let's say Fayaz Nasab was getting 500 to I think 750 rupees, and the others were much less. So now we move to her musical style. Her repertoire, manner of elaboration, taan patterns, voice projection, and modulation, everything bore the style of Alladia Masab's Jaipur Atroli style. Although she had learned from diverse gurus, it's obvious that this was the style that she retained through her performances. She was very particular about not recording her voice, but first of all, these brothers convinced her, and then HLB also convinced her, but she wouldn't perform for the radio. So a little bit about her style. You will notice that there's a breadth and depth of voice, clarity in the projection, very forthright quality, very well chiseled taans or swift melodic passages, and such a voice, such a broad voice, you would feel that it would be largely inflexible and not very smooth. But you will notice that the speed she gets through her taans is really amazing, and it continues to inspire generations of... Yeah, go ahead. That's courage for you, and thank you very much.
Yeah.